There is so much happening in AI right now, it's hard to keep track of the latest changes. But are people getting real value out of it? Today, we're going to dig into where things are going, so stay tuned. Today, we have with us Mark Kurtz, CTO of Neural Magic, where Mark leads a team of engineers and researchers creating cutting-edge solutions for deep learning challenges. Neural Magic was founded in 2017 by MIT professors and research scientists, and most recently, the company raised a $35 million Series A round led by NEA with participation from Andreessen Horowitz, VMware, Verizon, Amdocs, Comcast, Pillar, and Ridgeline Ventures. So let's talk with Mark about the state of AI and where things are going. Welcome, Mark.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me on. Really excited to talk through and be on the podcast.
AI is in a funny place now. I mean, literally, my email mailbox is just absolutely inundated with AI offerings, this AI, that AI, my company will do AI, like produce your generative AI models for you, blah, blah, blah. It's just endless. And like my news feeds are just like every day it's something crazy new, development in the world of AI. We were talking before we started here about how when we talked previously, like so many things have changed in just that short amount of time. It's absolutely crazy. But, why don't we start at, you're at Neural Magic, so you're in the middle of this all the time. What are you seeing as sort of like the state of generative AI right now? I mean, that seems to be the hot topic.
Well, there's the community push and then the enterprise push. And community is hacking around and doing quite a bit more. And I think it differs a little bit from what enterprises are actually trying to do, where community is all about, and the open source ecosystem are all about, agents. How do I optimize my life, right? AI assistants, things like these. Are there ways to run these locally on my computer so I can be a little bit more productive in my life? Enterprise, because they have a little bit more standards and need a lot of control around what they're putting out, how they're processing data, things like that. They're definitely a lot less risk taking and more risk adverse towards agents and things like that. So they're really kind of just trying to scale up and figure out how does this fit into my current ecosystem and build on top of it. So they're less working on agents and more just augmenting a lot of pathways. So most of the common ones are, blogs or image generation, things like that. So content augmentation and even coding generation. Right. And quite a few are now getting into, trying to replace chatbots and things like that. But a ton of human oversight over the top of these just to make sure that, they have control over the brand and control over their image. So I'd say, these two different sides are really kind of weighing and going a little bit in opposite directions on what they're trying to do.
And I think their needs are so vastly different too. And I so like, starting with like the corporate side of it, right? I mean, I think that, probably the biggest push that's been happening, I mean, besides just ChatGPT in general, kind of driving the market. But I think in the enterprise, most companies are being inundated about Copilot and things like that, right? And I think the challenge I've seen a lot of companies, they've been deploying Copilot, but I don't know that they've once they get it in, they kind of go, and now what? What do I do with this now, right? So it's that question of like, do you feel like companies are really seeing the value in some of the deployments they're doing right now? And, because it's changing so fast, do you think that there's an advantage to getting into it early or not at this point?
To take the second question first, towards getting in early and advantages there, absolutely. Because I think, and this has been just throughout my career, the number one thing that hinders AI adoption in any enterprise, before we had all the computer vision pushes and NLP and now NLG and the generative AI push, the thing that's hindered it has just been, business people and product people and just kind of holistically across these companies understanding where the risks are and how to implement AI within their products. So I think getting in early and getting those experiences is absolutely critical, regardless of if you're going to have immediate success. It's one of those things that you have to invest in and be ready to take on. And then looking at, what's possible today in the enterprises and what we've seen, a lot of it focuses around kind of more core traditional use cases that are starting to get replaced. So to take one example, Amazon and Google and all of them have replaced most of their teams that were traditionally on the Google Assistant and Amazon Alexa, things like that, traditionally NLP. They've replaced all of those primarily with these Gen AI pushes. So, a lot of investment.
And just to clear up, NLP is natural language processing. I know we have a tendency to get into a lot of acronyms and things. I just want to make sure everybody understands what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, we're looking at a lot of replacement and big bets on Gen AI for things that are assistant based and especially translation based. So those are easy fixes, to put in where you do have assumed risk for the user coming in of maybe it's not going to be 100% correct, right? And also these pathways where you have human moderation over the top of it. So being able to augment human processes in terms of code generation and things like that. Those are really easy to plug in currently. The ones that get a little bit harder are the ones where we are controlling outbound messaging. So chat messaging, I know a few airlines have gone out there and replaced their chatbots, but they always have that little critical help button, take me to a human. And I think these are just kind of the growing pains that happen, and people are getting better about how they can mitigate the risks around Gen AI. Just because there are issues with hallucination and bias, and those are not going to go away anytime soon. So the big thing is investing in, one, your understanding of those, and two, being able to build out the risk tolerance and pipelines to control those so that you can scale it in your enterprise.
You're pointing to something I think is really critical, is sort of like, and maybe it is too, with like getting in early is a big part of this too, but like getting to the point where you understand what the limitations of it are, and so that you can direct it better, or not fall prey to being overly confident in how it's performing. But one of the things too is when we talk about sort of like a lot of the use cases we see, there's a conversation that's happening around the idea that a lot of these are creative processes that we're seeing coming out of generative AI. And the idea was AI was supposed to relieve us of all the mundane tasks so that we could do the creative work. And I don't think we've quite gotten there yet. What are your thoughts on that?
A few thoughts on that. One is just, in terms of the immediate creative needs and things like that. So, putting out blogs or augmenting code generation, things like that. Those
or podcasts.
Or podcasts, sure.
which Google has offered up to everybody.
Yeah, the Notebook LM. That's it's an interesting play. But yeah, all of that is a lot easier to plug in right now because it is an iterative process and it's something that easily has human oversight over the top of it, right? The things that are harder to plug in out of the box right now are the ones that are fully automated pathways, right? So controlling a robot to go through, in the 6D space and make sure that it's not bending itself over backwards or going through your part, things like that. Those become a lot harder because there is no tolerance, right? You have to be exact, and the same thing applies to JSON schemas if you're taking in payloads, things like that, right? Very strict setups where a difference in a token can make or break things, right? Whenever we're in the creative industry, a difference of a token doesn't really matter as much, provided that it is still convincing to a human, right? And that's the thing, is that just the interfaces are a lot more lax on the creative side. But the other side of that is that all of these generative AI models are trained on just immense masses of data, and to the point that we're almost running out of clean data. Well, I think we're within an order of magnitude of running out of clean data to be able to train on. And yeah, it's one of the things that it's memorizing that average and predicting based on that, average that it collects. So it's, the new processes and new generation trying to influence new pathways in culture and society. I don't think Gen AI is close to that or going to be doing that anytime soon, but I think it will help augment humans to get to the next pathways that we can.
I want to highlight what you're talking about, because I've been hearing from some folks in the AI space that they've actually sort of tapped pretty much the maximum capability of all the available training data right now. And so now we're we're getting into a world where one, we have to start taking a look at different approaches, I think, to solving some of these challenges. But there's also like this issue of synthetic data now that we're getting, where you have to there's not enough training data, so let's create some training data. And then thirdly, we have this issue of rights over content. I mean, especially when we're talking about like the creative stuff, right? We've had so many issues. I mean, like literally the strikes in Hollywood were about AI, and we're seeing a lot of lawsuits happening about image galleries and things like that that have been taken. And I think you can really see that too. You see, like when you see generative AI, I can see the faces of celebrities in the mix of things, so they're definitely leveraging, those things very heavily. But so like, what are your thoughts on, like the challenges around training data? What are our pathways out of that, and synthetic data? What do you think about that?
Starting with just the training data and running out of it, I think it's something that was very easy for the big companies to scale, right? Just to start off, it's something that they've done a lot of. They have a ton of data available to them already, and then scale out on top of that. And it's pretty much just an OpEx, right? Throw some cash into it, and we're going to scale up and get the best model, and then we'll see where it goes from there. And, along those lines, Zuckerberg and all of these other people have come out and said, this is a significant investment that we're doing, but it's one that we can't miss out on. And even if it doesn't pay off, we can recycle all this hardware. So the current state that we're in, and the fastest pathway to get something that was impressive, was just to scale data and scale compute. And now that we're at the limits of that, I think we have to start getting a lot smarter on our algorithms. I don't think it's going to be the O1 pathway and trying to throw in more contextual tokens, because there's a lot of research coming out about chain of thought prompting and things like that, and how that can help certain regimes, especially ones that are well structured, and getting into math, or if you're trying to prove out logic or coding, things like that, things that are very easily testable, then can easily push that boundary. But that's a ton of compute. You have to have an environment that you can test in, and it doesn't solve. You don't have that in every problem that Gen AI is trying to apply to. So I think we have to get a lot more creative and smarter and move past standard gradient descent, because gradient descent is just moving through this huge optimization space. I mean, just absolutely massive to the scale that we've never seen before. Moving through this optimization space, and it's memorizing the average between that. And luckily, it doesn't overfit to that data, right? It's trying to figure out that trend that extends to the next set of batches that are coming in. And so ultimately, I think the big thing is it has to be a double down on, at least moving forward, a double down on smaller data, and smarter algorithms. And for people that are trying to implement with what's out there right now, it's kind of the same thing, right? Get cleaner data, scale down your data, and make sure that you can not try to solve everything with a single model, right? Be able to focus these models on what your core needs are and put some pipelines around it to ensure that it's going to meet those needs. So I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah. I've been really intrigued by the idea of like smaller models, because when you start looking at the performance of some of these AI models versus the cost to run them, you can see these, they kind of, there's definitely a trajectory that they're on. And I think that, some of these smaller models that are more heavily trained, more tokenized, than some of the really, really big high parameter count models, I think there's some really compelling things going on there. And I think that, for, like a OpenAI, for example, there's an incentive there to build the really big models because it's a competitive advantage. Not everybody can have a data center full of, servers and, things and running constantly. So, but I think, we're seeing really interesting results from some of these smaller models that are just more trained. And and putting them together with agents, which I would love to get your take on, smaller models, agents, moving it from the data center more back towards the edge. Obviously I know you're a proponent of these smaller models. Could you speak to how that all works and how like integrating multiple models and agents and all that kind of brings it together?
The big thing is, and as you said, OpenAI has a vested interest in these larger models and be able to have a chatbot interface that ideally does everything, right?
Right.
And as you've seen, there's quite a few issues that come out of that, and trying to plug in with that. One is just that you have to put a lot of safeties around it. You essentially create a new position for prompt engineers, right? And coming in, which is just another ability to code. You're trying to figure out how to change this model and tweak the context so that it gives you the output you expect. And there's some risks there as well, which is if they change the model, all of those prompts that you've done need to be reworked, right? Things like that.
Right.
So whenever you can come in and limit the scope, because not everybody needs this model that can do everything. And also, whenever you scale up these model sizes and you try to solve every single problem, it's just the amount of surface area that you have risk around
Right.
grows exponentially, right? So if you can minimize that surface area, try and specialize these models into the core tasks that you're worried about, it means that you can get dedicated teams, dedicated evaluations, and control the lifecycle. And also, these smaller models make it tractable for you to train and fine tune and control, right? And that's kind of the big thing: is that are you at the mercy of whatever OpenAI, or well, I guess OpenAI if you're doing the open APIs, or Meta if you're doing the open source, right? You're at the mercy
Right.
of whatever data they collected, what that model learns from that data, rather than being able to tweak what it's learned to what you want it to do, right? And what identity you want it to have, and be able to push out. So I think these are the big things: is that whenever you scale down the model size, you can specialize them more. It becomes a lot more tractable to be able to do model life cycles on these, right? Rather than spending millions of dollars to train a large one.
Yeah.
You can do it for a few thousand for some of these small models to fine tune them to a small data set. That becomes very tractable for startups, or extremely tractable for large enterprises to be able to put a lifecycle around and actively improve that and build it into their product, right? And all of that chains together, as you said, with agents and things like that, because the more we can limit the scope on these LLMs, the more we can, it's not that we're necessarily going to get rid of bias or hallucinations or anything like that, but it makes it a lot easier to build safeties around it. So we know when they're acting up and when we need to reevaluate, right? Because if we're just trying to push out a model that solves everything, we're at that just creative interface where you need a human interpret, being able to come over and interpret what the output is and if that's correct or not. But if we can scale down the risk profile, now we can get to the point of automation and being able to put some safeties around it, both in terms of are people, if it's exposed to the internet, are people doing prompt injection, but more importantly, on the end of it, right, we can do quick tests on, is this an accurate model, or an accurate output. To give an example, if somebody's coming through and trying to parse unstructured data and pull out some figures. Maybe they're trying to fill out a loan application for somebody, across all these different websites, right?
Yeah.
If you can come in and say, hey, for what it populated, if they said the max value that they're trying to get is 1.2 million or something like that, you can go through and say, does this exist in the original input, right, for the output that comes out. So there's a lot of easy things like that we can control a lot more as we scale down the size and control the lifecycle around.
Having the agent-based approach to things, and to the point where, like, I think, like having some intentionality about going out and seeking the kind of answers that you're, being proactive about, sort of like overnight. Here's all the things that happen that you should be paying attention to. Maybe this model is now better, so I'm going to shift my, workloads over to this model, and like piecing together this whole much larger ecosystem that may have a lot of variable components in it. Really seems interesting, and we've seen different approaches from the big model people around this, like the mixture of experts and things like that in there, and some of those types of things. And I think when you look at, we were talking about OpenAI O1, which has a very different approach to it's kind of, we talk about vibe checking, like running it, which is kind of similar to what you were talking about on the insurance example you gave, going checking, does this make sense, kind of thing. But like checking to see if does this sound like it's AI, is it full of hallucinations, is it doing those kinds of things. It internally does a lot of that, and checks itself and tries to come up with better answers based on some of those checks. Do you feel like that has kind of not achieved what they wanted to achieve? And how do you think some of these bigger models are going to look at some of the newer developments like that?
For the big model companies, I mean, and actually this is mainly specifically at OpenAI, just because Sam Altman has come out multiple times and said he's trying to do Gen AI and he wants one model to solve everything, right?
Yeah.
If you look at Meta and Yan LeCun, his initiative, he very much sees these, I think, aligned with how I see these, which are they're another tool that we can tweak and train. And if we scale up the size, they become a little bit more general. They can memorize more data, right? But and they're an interesting tool, but I don't think they're on the path towards Gen AI. And this kind of gets into the O1 or the Strawberry release, which is
right.
And it's also
and how many R's are in that Strawberry?
That's right.
For those of you who are not familiar with that, there was a big problem of OpenAI or AIs in general identifying how many R's are actually in Strawberry, typically coming up with 2. And that's largely because it's all tokenized and they're not looking at the actual word; they're looking at the tokens. So, anyways, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
It was a great meme that was blowing up. But yeah, whenever we're looking at O1 Strawberry, and especially looking at how OpenAI is shifting very much to a commercial company, something like Strawberry is a great move for them because it's just processing more and more tokens to get a single answer. We're going up by 40x processing. 40 times the compute to get a single answer. So it's a great move for them just to get more capital coming in. And obviously they probably, whenever they initially started it, they probably weren't going after that. But it does.
Well, Sam Altman's great at raising money, for sure.
He is.
He's got that reality distortion field around him.
That's right. So they're all going after these. One model solves all, and it becomes, again, it's just a huge surface area to try and track and work with. And whenever we get into Strawberry or things like these, it doesn't necessarily get rid of the hallucinations. And ultimately, the problem statement again has to be logically testable by that model. And even within that, if the model wasn't trained on that specific format, then we're going to hit issues with hallucination and bias even within its logical thinking. So this kind of gets into, is Strawberry an efficient way to solve those problems? Because there were multiple that came out in the past that were more evolutionary style algorithms or reinforcement learning, things like that solved all these math problems very well. Strawberry is starting to set some new benchmarks, but it's one of those things that if we just scaled the reinforcement learning that had, towards your earlier point of how many R's are in Strawberry, the reinforcement learning side has its very specific mathematical language coming in that has a strict structure around it that makes it a lot more testable as compared to natural language, right? So if we just applied the same scale to those techniques, where would those end up, right? And is that going to be more efficient than trying to have next token prediction solve everything, right? Just based on natural language.
Yeah, and I think scale's an interesting discussion around that too, because like OpenAI raised $6.6 billion of VC funding, and like you mentioned, Sam Altman has stated that my intention is to build an artificial general intelligence, right? Which is really a big deal. And at the same time, you're seeing a lot of people leaving OpenAI. I mean, like Ilya is gone, and who's sort of the conscience of OpenAI. A lot of people, would think, and so a lot of the talent has sort of left. At the same time, they're raising all this money and trying to build an AGI, which means that they would have to massively scale. And just in terms of like pure compute power, the cost of that, I think, is going to far exceed the 6.6 billion that they've raised. So, I just wonder, it looks like a huge amount of money in this, potentially multi-trillion dollar, market that's out there that, hasn't materialized yet, but is in theory going to materialize. I just see that kind of as a bit of a risky bet, just going as big and big and big as you can.
If I was in charge of a fund that big, through these people that went in, I would not have invested to that level. I think OpenAI was
Well, that Microsoft and Apple backed away from it, right? So, I mean, I think that says something.
Yeah, and I mean, Sam Altman is, as you said, probably he may be the best fundraiser that we've seen in kind of the modern startup day.
He's got that kind of Steve Jobs-ish, like flair about it. It's like, hey, this is going to be amazing. One more thing.
Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, towards your point, it's they're trying to scale out compute. The question is that the right pathway to go down? My opinion is no, because fundamentally, when we're working with any kind of a gradient descent or SD or deep learning, we've seen these hallucinations, we've seen these issues through every single stage of model and application that these have come out. They're not going to go away without another technique, and also, I mean, it takes so much to scale, right? I mean, there definitely is a scaling law, but it's also that scaling law is a power law, right? So to get, to the point of the benchmarks that we're looking at now, to increase those even by 2%, we're looking at going from 405 billion parameters now up to maybe 800 billion or a trillion, right? And it's something that doesn't become scalable to deploy, and it also doesn't become scalable to train. And towards your point earlier, again, about running out of training data, what is that compute going to go to, right? So, if you can generate data that memorizes the world, then it's a perfect bet. It's a perfect play, right? And you can scrape that data, you can push it out. But as we start running out of data and we start running out of specializations, it's one of those things that these agent-based systems, these specialized systems, to be able to solve specific problems and be able to control the interactions between them, become a lot safer of a bet, because you don't have to spend anywhere near the amount of money, anywhere near the amount of training data to be able to create these. And it's one of those things that I don't think is going to work out in the near future for them. And I think this is probably why they're going to that commercial play.
Well, and I got to imagine Sam wants to get paid for all the work he's done.
Oh, absolutely.
That's probably a big part of all of it. So, we talk a lot about OpenAI because they're kind of like the 800-pound gorilla in the space at the moment. But there's a lot of other really interesting companies. I mean, there's a million other companies out there. But I mean, in terms of the model space, you mentioned Meta, which has Lambda, which, when you look at MMLU benchmarks and things like that, and, their performance based, relative to their cost, they're actually doing really well. And as an open source model, I think that that is a really compelling sort of thing. But then there's, the Anthropics of the world, and then like you have Ilya's company that's going to be doing, focusing on a safe, version of AI, right? And so that it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of that. And at the same time, we're seeing, people leaving OpenAI and, publishing the models like, here's how you build ChatGPT 2, here's all the scripts and everything you need to just create your own version of it, right? So I think on the one hand, this some of this stuff is getting easier to do. I don't think at this point, creating a large language model is really that difficult. Like making it useful and improving it and tweaking it around the edges certainly is. Do you see, do you see the open source world winning out in this battle? I mean, I feel like this is something that is going to become so pervasive, and it just having some sort of public kind of model of that sort really benefits everyone.
I see open source as essentially critical towards these pathways, and this is primarily on two fronts. One is from a safety perspective. right? Just being able to come in and, I mean, obviously a lot of these companies like Meta and Google and others that are pushing out public weights, they're not pushing out the data sets and, get into copyright issues and legal issues if they were to do
Yeah,
that.
for
So
sure.
yeah, definitely not doing that, and makes it a little bit less open, but it's still one of those things that you can see the weights, you can inspect them, you can do whatever you want to try and perturb them and figure out where these prompt injection attacks lie and things like that, right? So you can figure out a lot of the risk exposure on these models, which we can't do to just a closed API. So that's kind of one of the sides is just around safety. But the second one is just around the whole point of what I was raising earlier is that the more you can test and evaluate these models, the more likely it is that you can deploy them into these specific scenarios. And I don't, I've never talked with Yen LeCun or anything like that, but I imagine, or Zuck, but I imagine that's really where their focus is they can push out these open source models that they have a large investment in, that they want to use internally, but they want as much testing on these as possible. Right. And that's what you
And
get from
additional
an open
people
source community.
developing for it too, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The stack around it, everything. I mean, these are immense projects that they're putting in millions of dollars into and just for a single training run. And yeah, they want to get as much legwork on that they put out as possible. And it goes towards exactly as you said, the stack that they can put around it and get from open source, the testing they can get from it, all of that, which just pushes them leaps and bounds ahead of where closed source is going to go, I would say in probably the next year or two.
I do want to touch on one other aspect too of all this, that there's a lot that AI is doing behind the scenes that's really interesting. I mean, because what at the start of this, we talked about it's how just rapidly everything is changing, and there's a lot of I saw some stat about the amount of code that's being generated by AI now, and it was like 57% of code on GitHub or something like that is being generated by AI, but the thing is that there's a lot of grunt work in developing software that AI is actually really doing a good job, like just from testing and like continuous integration, continuous deployment models and things like that, and the rate at which AI is helping people sort of turn over some of these issues and identify issues and resolve issues. And I think that's part of why we've just seen this. It almost feels like an exponential leap in development in some regards. It just like the amount that has changed in the tech space in the last like 3 years is like more than I've ever seen in the industry. And I just feel like that's just still accelerating, which is both good and bad, I suppose, right? What do you see as somebody who's in the mix of it, doing the development work and helping people develop, their systems? How do you see AI impacting that end of it?
Just from a personal anecdote, I use it all the time. Right, I have both Copilot and ChatGPT and all of those just to and we have some internal models as well to try and bring down some of those costs. But yeah, I use it all the time just because it is one of those things, as you said, is doing a lot of the grunt work and getting a lot of these things that, I don't want to think about a specific name of a variable or, remember how to write a for loop across, 6 different languages, things like that, right?
Right.
So, or all the syntactic differences and things like that. So,
well, you can actually write in your language of choice and then have AI convert it to whatever you need the project to be in, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that's something that will continue to build, and you're absolutely right in terms of what I've seen a lot of as well, to be able to augment the core code and be able to plug in CI/CD program or CI/CD projects and testing projects and all that around it, right? So it is very much starting to augment and inject itself in our current world. But obviously there are, a lot of IP and data privacy issues that companies need to figure out themselves to go through as they expose that to their internal engineers and things like that. But the one thing that I would caution with and say is that it is a great tool if you're experienced, right?
Yeah.
And it's mainly just because it is going to make mistakes And unless you have some, you have that guiding knowledge to go over the top of it and say, hey, no, fix this way, fix this way. It's something that can lend itself towards a lot of potential mistakes and open yourselves up to some liabilities and things like that. So, it's a great tool to, as you are an active coder and have gotten experience, but I definitely would not use it to scale up on, maybe to do some quick projects and give you an example, but you really got to play around and inject yourself into that to understand what's wrong with the different pieces. And if you're just getting 2,000 lines of code dumped out at you, it's hard to go through and learn exactly what each of those lines is doing. So that's the one caution that I would give around.
Well, and it raises the question about like more supply chain type of attacks too, because if you've got a model that you can inject some malicious code into what it's building, somehow through either prompt engineering or messing with the training data or whatever it is, messing with the model, that and people at some point are just going to be like trusting the output and just moving on with things, and I think that's a very dangerous thing. I saw an interesting it was a teacher who came on and she was talking about all this existential dread and sort of like, what is even the point of me doing any of this stuff that these kids just want to use AI to do that? And then somebody then came back and said, well, I would say that your teaching methodologies are failing you, because this is sort of the new thing in the world, new paradigm, and what you need to do is teach your kids how to use this. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about here too, right? It's because there's this one teacher I know, a professor. She was having her students write a paper using AI, and then they were bringing them back and sort of reading through them and saying, like, how can we edit this? How can we identify things that are weak writing? How do we identify the source of these materials? How do we identify, like just really leveraging AI, but, like really going through that process of, vibe checking it, as, is often referred to. Do you, as somebody who's working with a lot of people in AI and probably hiring a lot of people in AI, do you find that like people are coming to this kind of lacking those kind of, I don't want to say like critical thinking skills, but I guess it is kind of a critical thinking skill, to tackle these AI challenges?
It's a great thing to bring up and a great thing to talk to. I think, as you said, it is another tool that people need to adapt to and want to adapt to, right? I think I forgot when I saw it, but there was some quote from a old history book talking about how people were moving toward pencil and paper, right, rather than just memorizing everything.
Right,
and
right.
it's one of those things that technology is going to keep advancing. People will be
For sure.
hesitant to adopt, but I think you're absolutely right that this is something core that I think will help out a lot of people, because it is one of those things that it fills in a lot of that ground, that legwork for you, and you can come in and then focus your efforts on what you need to be doing. And as you said, that's really, I think, and I'm not nowhere near an educator, so definitely don't take my opinion for as truth here. But I would say, being able to adapt and say that here's the groundwork that these tools are giving you, and being able to do the critical thinking on top of it, being able to adapt it, being able to personalize it to your tone of voice, to your opinion, things like that.
Yeah.
Those are really critical, because if you don't adapt, people are just going to do it behind your backs, and you're either going to race to try and build out the tools to detect it, right, or you're going to race to try and build people on top of it.
Well, now there's a lot of discussions around like which AIs are best for doing those vibe checks to make them sound less like AI, so they're virtually undetectable. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell me, like, so what's next for Neural Magic? Where are you guys going?
Yeah. So looking at everything we've talked through here, we do see a big investment happening in Gen AI across everyone. And we've always been very focused on efficient deep learning and being able to make that both cost efficient and energy efficient. And this is where we're continuing to double down on. So, today we're actually pushing out compressed models of all the top Gen AI models. So these are ones that we've come in and removed a lot of the redundancies from these models. And this is also kind of, a call back towards the earlier point of if we need to find better algorithms, all of these
Right.
models we can compress significantly. So there is a lot of space left over in these models that is wasted in the training optimization space that we can essentially either reduce the precision of through quantization, or just outright move the connections through pruning. And so this is what we really specialize on. And ultimately, this means that we can get, 4x up to, in some of our earlier numbers, not on the latest models, but we're working on getting those up to date now. But yeah, up to 10x on some platforms. So, right. So a 10x improvement in your performance, 10x cheaper, 10x more energy efficient. So this is where we're really focused on, is being able to make all of that as easy as possible so you can build out a control plane essentially around your Gen AI applications, put all of these pipeline pieces around that, make it a system that you're confident in deploying, and make sure that's not going to break the bank or significantly hurt the environment ideally. So this is everything that we're working on and really pushing heavily on. And a lot of that is made up of open source contributions as well as some enterprise licensing.
If somebody wanted to get some of that compressed model goodness, where should they go?
Check out, I think the number one place to start would probably be our Hugging Face org. So Neural Magic on Hugging Face, we have all of our open source models pushed up there with instructions on how to deploy them, all the evals around them, so you can check them out and run them locally. And ultimately, hopefully not need $120,000 server to deploy one of these models,
Yes.
so that you can run them locally on your machines and on smaller servers.
Yeah, Hugging Face seems to be ground zero for AI right now. So yeah, that's pretty cool. And it's cool that you're distributing them open source and doing all that too. I think that's super valuable to the world. So thank you for doing that.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, Mark, it's been absolutely awesome talking to you. I could start on about 30 more topics that I would love to talk to you about right now, but I don't think anybody would still be here when we're done. But it's been absolutely enlightening talking to you, and great fun, and good luck with everything you're doing in the wild world of AI.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it, and excited to see who else you bring on, because I've been a fan for a little bit, and it's been really great seeing everybody you've been bringing on and all the insights you've been bringing.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thanks for watching. I would love to hear your thoughts on the state of AI in the comments below, and if you could, give us a like, think about subscribing, share this with a friend, and I will see you in the next one.